Okay, Kami-sama back here and welcome to another video. Today, as your resident retro Lolita, I'd like to talk to you about why your hell bunny dress will not work for Lolita. Few bits of housekeeping to get out of the way. One, I have works going on outside my window and I'm not in control of the noises that said work creates. Two, I've made the decision to rely on the natural light today, so if it decides to get rainy all of a sudden, or at least really cloudy, I'll have to cross that bridge when I get there. Three, although I said hell bunny, I do in fact mean all vintage reproduction or vintage dresses. Hell bunny is just a catchy title, and because historically in the past there have been Lolitas who try to pass off a rockabilly dress as Lolita. Moreover, whilst they are a bit of a scapegoat, I'm really sorry, Hell Bunny is an amazing clothing company. It's just not Lolita. And although I'm using them as an umbrella term, I don't actually own a Hell Bunny dress myself. I own other vintage reproduction and vintage dresses. So to exemplify what I'm talking about, I'll be using images of those. And where possible, I'll also try and include stock pictures of some of the other more popular examples, and all of the examples that I'll talk about as far as the Hell Bunny side goes will be within a similar price range as Hell Bunny. For those of you who are not into vintage fashions at all, vintage reproduction, not unlike Lolita, has its own brands and has its own different levels of luxury, budget and mid-range, and of course its own fair share of knockoffs, replicas, whatnot. So whilst some of the things that I'll touch on will not necessarily be true per se for the vintage reproduction dresses, the point will still stand in terms of using them as Lolita. And also every single example that I'll be showing you is aiming for a similar budget as Hell Bunny, which is mid-range. In Lolita context, this would be what you'd expect to pay for a more established Chinese brand. We're not talking super cheap like Tualis, and we're not talking top end like Hinana Queen or Henrietta, but something in between that. Something that would roughly set you back between £60 to £100. I think that's it as far as housekeeping things go. All that's left to do before we delve into the video is to encourage you to subscribe and to click the bell button next to it, because my upload schedule is not regular. I don't even know at time of recording when this particular video will come out. So you'll definitely want to make sure to subscribe and to click the bell. And if you want to definitely make sure that you don't miss the videos that I upload and that you get them early, I do have a Patreon, the link for which is also in the description box below. And by joining the $2 a month tier, you'll be able to catch each video 1 week before it goes public. So, why is it then that your Hell Bunny dress will not work for Lolita and will not work as a Lolita, JSK or OP? Those who are newer but have delved deep enough into their research will probably have found out by now that in the past there have been some Lolitas trying to wear rockabilly dresses or vintage reproduction dresses as JSKs for Lolita fashion, and it backfired. These days, thankfully, it's not something that we tend to see that often. This is the upside of having Lolita fashion become so much more widely available and more easily accessible, both in terms of how to shop for it and in terms of having something for almost every budget. But it still happens every now and then. Someone goes on. Again, I'm picking on Hell Bunny a little bit because they have a certain aesthetic that appeals to Lolitas and they just go, ooh, I could use this for my next Halloween themed or whatever themed co-ord. Hold your horses. Trust me. To people who have been into Lolita fashion, if not for a long time, then at least very intensively, and they've absorbed all that knowledge that is already out there, what I'll talk about will be somewhat obvious, even if you might not have necessarily put a name to it. So this is aimed more towards those newer to the fashion or those who lack the understanding of what makes something Lolita and what doesn't, as well as how, despite the clear influence on Lolita from vintage reproduction and vintage fashions, they're not the same thing and they're not easily compatible. I'm not saying it's impossible, I'm saying it's not your entry-level stuff. Point number one is detail, or the level of finish on a dress. In principle, a vintage reproduction dress will be far simpler than even a simple Lolita dress. And by simple, I don't necessarily mean printed versus non-printed, because if you look at non-printed Lolita dresses, they tend to make up for the lack of print with tons of structural details, ruffles, tiers, pin tucks, lace, trims, whatever you fancy. When we say vintage reproduction, we tend to aim more towards the 1950s. And whilst historically the 1950s, and particularly the Dior's new look silhouette, have influenced Lolita to an extent and have been almost vulgar in how excessive they were at the time, straight after World War II, when fabric rationing was still a thing. In comparison to Lolita, even that nipped in waist and gigantic skirt silhouette is still far simpler, because it relies only on the fit of the waist and the flare of the skirt. There are no other elements that a Lolita dress will have. The same applies when we look at printed releases. Whilst Angelic Pretty has been getting tons of flack recently for having very simple JSK and OP cuts with their printed releases, this is in comparison to the printed releases they've been doing previously, not in comparison to rockabilly or vintage reproduction dresses. Because again, there are elements in those that do not appear in vintage reproduction fashion. The use of lace at the hem, gathers, yokes, trims around the shoulder straps. A vintage reproduction dress relies primarily on cut, on the overall cut, being that hourglass silhouette, which tends to lean more A-line than cupcake, accentuating the waist, and a couple, one or two cut choices for something else, either pleats or a particular neckline detail, maybe a tiny bit of a gather, a keyhole detail, something like this, and certainly not to the extent that we see in Lolita fashion. The second element is the idea of cuteness or softness, which Lolita has, that vintage reproduction and rockabilly doesn't really aim for. Some of what I say here, or most of what I say in this particular point, will apply more so to sweet and classic Lolita, and a little bit less to gothic, but even there, depending on what kind of gothic that you wear, you'll find some of these to be true. Even the simplest Lolita dress, because of how the fashion came about, aims for a degree of cuteness or softness, or to put it simply, a level of kawaii that vintage reproduction and rockabilly don't, because it's not in their nature. Vintage reproduction fashion aims to recreate looks of adult women from around 1950s or whatever other era the fashion's for. As I said, in here we're mostly focusing on 1950s. Rockabilly does the same, but with more of a playful, edgy twist on it. And in 1950s, fashion for adult women was still what drove the fashion industry. All throughout fashion up until 1960s, fashion trends were created for adults, by adults, and they centered around the idea of elegance. Whereas Lolita fashion is a reinterpretation by the Japanese of Victorian and Rococo clothing by the upper classes and the aristocracy. Fashions that were a lot more gaudy by our standards, and fashions that reveled in including all kinds of detail in there, predominantly for the display of wealth, but also because that was simply the fashionable silhouette at the time, as well as fashions that were unashamedly feminine in the types of details used, Again, lace, ruffles, flowers. This isn't to say that men didn't use trims like this, especially in terms of Rococo fashion, but obviously Lolita is looking at feminine fashions. And as I mentioned before, because 1950s didn't really incorporate those elements in clothing for adult women, the simpler cuts and a higher reliance on straight lines simply don't read quite as feminine enough. This is a slightly abstract concept to try and explain, and I don't think I've done a particularly good job of it right here. But hopefully the images that I'm putting up on screen right now of comparing two OPs makes that point a bit clearer. The Metamorphosis classical sister OP, even though it's a very, very simple dress by Lolita standards, and even with the detachable yoke removed, has a softness to it. Where there are sharp lines, like on that square neckline, they're softened with the addition of lace, and there aren't that many sharp lines to begin with. On the other hand, the Voodoo Vixen dress, whilst there are some decorative elements and trims there, even they focused on sharper points and straighter lines, like the cuffs and the points of the collar and the belt. Despite this being whimsical and playful print, which arguably you could see something like this at some point in Lolita, either by a Japanese brand, Meta, or by a Chinese brand, it's not done in a way to exude the energy that's soft and cute and kawaii. It's there to be cool and funky, and I don't want to say edgy, but edgy. And this entire point, whilst also linking with the previous one, ties into the next one in that Lolita fashion and vintage reproduction aim at two different types of femininity and feminine expression. As already mentioned, Lolita is about softness and cuteness and being kawaii, but also about being unashamedly feminine, hyper feminine even, for the female gaze. It's not there for the male gaze, it's not there to please patriarchal expectations of women, it's by its very nature the opposite of that. Whereas rockabilly and vintage reproduction fashion aim to recreate looks from a time period when male gaze and patriarchal expectations of women were still commonplace and not questioned too openly. Although obviously the women wouldn't have gone for certain clothing and certain silhouettes unless they found it appealing, majority of fashion designers at that time who were big were men. The entire silhouette of New Look was created by Dior, a man. Women embraced it, but a man created it because he thought that this was pleasing on a female silhouette. 1950s fashion, although still modest by standards set in the 21st century, nonetheless exudes feminine energy in ways that Lolita doesn't. Up until the skirt, the shape is quite fitted, which Lolita isn't always. You can have fitted bodice, but a lot of the times the slightly looser fit, at least by a little bit, is preferred. Vintage and rockabilly looks very often feature naked shoulders, which Lolita doesn't. There's an emphasis on, if not showing more cleavage, then at least framing your chest area in a more flattering way and not trying to hide your chest. Whereas Lolita is taking the modesty by more Victorian standards, because let's face it, Rococo people like to flash, and bringing the necklines up higher and not placing so much emphasis on accentuating that curve. These are two different types of expressing femininity, neither of which is inherently wrong, but whilst one of them is at least concerning itself with the male gaze and what men might find attractive on a woman when she's clothed, the other one explicitly rejects that and goes for feminine expression that is as extremely feminine as possible, because this is what pleases women and what women want to see within that fashion. Which leads to the last 2 points, which is more specific to cuts, and it branches out into 2 directions, one being waist placement and one being neckline and straps. Because as far as skirts go, there isn't so much of a difference. Yes, vintage reproduction and rockabilly will rely more on A-line rather than cupcake, but that isn't to say that cupcake doesn't feature in those fashions at all. Moreover, Lolita does have dresses with A-line silhouettes. Both of them aim for roughly similar length, being knee length or slightly below, and both of them are designed with the explicit purpose of fitting in a petticoat, so having volume. So cut differences in there are not necessarily why your hell bunny dress won't work, and why so many newer Lolitas have fallen into the trap of thinking that will be just fine for my Lolita first coat, thank you very much. As I've already mentioned, vintage and rockabilly fashions place very high emphasis on the waist and on accentuating the waist. They promote an hourglass silhouette as the ideal, and as such you'll see all kinds of features aiming to nip the waist in. Waist ties, belts, panels sewn in a way to imitate belts, things like this. And the waist itself is sitting at your natural waist. Obviously, when clothing is made as standard sizes, this won't apply to every single person out there, but it is generally much closer to one's natural waist than Lolita can be. In Lolita fashion, although we do have dresses with a lower waist line, or some that sit on your natural waist, some of these are called just waist, some of these are called drop waist. Depending on your own body proportions, these will sit differently. On me, someone who is an hourglass, Alice and the Pirates drop waist cuts sit pretty much exactly at my natural waist, which is why I like them so much. But also Innocent World, when they do a just waist dress, fits me nicely. Angelic Pretty's standard regular waist, as in the non-high waist option, tends to be ever so slightly higher than my natural waist, but is still near enough that I find it flattering on myself as someone who is an hourglass and who likes to accentuate my waist. But Lolita fashion also features other cuts. We have high waist dresses, we have empire waist, we have sack dresses with no definition of waist at all of which are still Lolita. If you tried to do a vintage reproduction dress with waistline anywhere else, it would stop being vintage reproduction and it would stop being rockabilly, because that is not the silhouette that was around in 1950s and that was promoted in those times as the fashionable silhouette for women. So whilst Lolita fashion does have pieces that have waist seam sitting at your natural waist depending on your body proportions, generally speaking the most popular cuts aim for something just that little bit higher, even if only by a couple of centimeters. And through placing the waist like this together with the cupcake skirt, or even with the A-line, the aim is to hide the hips. Forget hips exist, they don't exist in Lolita unless you have to pull something over them, but visually when you're looking at a coordinates, hips don't matter. They can't even lie because they're not there. Whereas in vintage reproduction and rockabilly, having your waist seam and waistline of the outfit at your natural waist not only accentuates it by making it appear smaller and drawing attention to the narrowest point of your torso, but also places that in juxtaposition to your wider hips and creating the hourglass silhouette where it's not there naturally. As far as necklines and straps are concerned, I almost have to split them just a little bit to make the point clearer. And these are things that I've already touched on earlier when talking about different kinds of feminine expression as well as aiming for cuteness versus not aiming for cuteness. In vintage reproduction, you see two types of necklines. They're either pretty high, not quite high neck or turtleneck like this, but kind of sitting on your collarbone, or they're quite low to accentuate your chest. Neither of which is a neckline that you see in Lolita. Whilst you may have sweetheart bodices in both, a sweetheart neckline in a Lolita dress will still sit higher so as to cover your cleavage rather than show it off. Moreover, where you have high necklines in Lolita fashion, these tend to be at your high necks. They're aiming for a more Victorian feel. And I can't think of many Lolita dresses where your neckline would sit at the collarbone, because that makes for really awkward when trying to then add a blouse underneath. If it's an OP that sits on your collarbone, it will already most likely have some sort of a collar. And if it's a JSK that would sit this high up, there's hardly any room for your collar to fit through that and sit flatteringly around that. Whilst I'm exemplifying this point here specifically on OPs and to show the height difference, if you rewind the video back to where I featured the Lady V dress, the one with cupcakes on it, that one has its neckline sitting around there. And you can see that if I tried to stuff a blouse under it, it would look pretty awkward unless it was a very, very lucky find in terms of a blouse cut. And that Lolita dresses, Lolita JSKs, will have that neckline sitting just a little bit lower in order to fit the blouse in. Then moving on to straps, which actually I'm going to use that same dress as an example. In vintage and rockabilly fashions, dresses are rarely cut to have separate straps. In the majority of cases, the straps are part of the bodice, and whilst that happens in Lolita as well, the dominant style is to have a bodice and then straps attached separately. This is more in relation to neckline, again, as I said, to fit a blouse over that without the two pieces fighting for space or fighting for attention, which is why even when Lolita brands do bodices that have straps built in, that neckline will be somewhat lower rather than sitting quite high. Ultimately, the point that is really important to keep in mind is that just as Lolita is not a direct reproduction of Victorian or Rococo fashions, it merely takes influence from it. Rockabilly isn't vintage reproduction, and vintage reproduction and rockabilly can exist side by side whilst not being the same thing. It's kind of like Lolita fashion and Otome fashion are related and share many aspects, but they're not the same. In other words, the point is that you can have two things exist separately yet share commonalities and share certain elements. This doesn't mean that they are by nature 100% compatible 100% of the time, and we will find elements of one in the other and vice versa. So just as we can see obvious and direct references from vintage 1950s rockabilly fashions on Lolita, that doesn't mean that they're the same thing. It just means that certain elements from one will work for the other. Because of this, it's not going to be a straightforward crossover, and this is why your Hell Bunny dress will not work for Lolita from the get-go. Is it completely impossible to style a rockabilly dress as Lolita? No. Can it be done? Yes, possibly, but not without very solid understanding both of what Lolita fashion is and what rockabilly and vintage reproduction fashions are. Before you start merging the two together, you have to understand how they work separately, which parts are the ones that are overlapping, and which ones are the ones that are different and how significant those differences are, because that will be what affects how successful your crossover is. Moreover, in order to make such a stretch when trying to fit a rockabilly dress and make it work as a Lolita one, you simply have to have the pieces. If you try and style everything off-brand, you'll need to have the most exquisite eye for detail, as well as very solid knowledge of Lolita fashion, what makes something Lolita and what stops it being Lolita, in order for the overall outfit to read as Lolita. Preferably you should have other pieces around that be Lolita, so that they can pull the dress up rather than highlight how out of place it looks in a Lolita coordinate. In other words, this is why Lolitas have been saying don't go for Hell Bunny or other rockabilly dresses and try and make them work for Lolita, because it is a lot of work trying to merge the two in a way that reads well, and for the amount of effort and possibly the amount of money that you'll invest if you don't already have the right pieces to go with it, you probably could have gotten yourself a Lolita coordinate secondhand, new from a Chinese brand or from an indie brand. Think about what you actually want to achieve, because if your goal is to get a Lolita look for cheaper, then you're going the wrong direction. You're barking up the wrong tree. If you have found a piece from Hellbody or from another rockabilly or vintage reproduction brand that you really like and you think that would make for a fantastic Lolita coordinate, that makes it more worth the effort, because you're potentially talking about styling a piece that does not exist within Lolita fashion realm and creating something unique that you wouldn't have been able to achieve otherwise, and that may be worth that effort. Having said this, considering how the vast majority of vintage reproduction and rockabilly dresses, when they are printed, they'll feature a novelty all over print, most of which lack the depth and detail to work as Lolita very well, and in the rare instances where they are a border print, they still stick within very similar themes as you see in Lolita quite commonly. Sweets, spoopy stuff, over holidays. Are you sure that you really can't find something like this that's already Lolita that will tick that box for you? Are you really that in love with this particular piece from a rockabilly or vintage reproduction company that you're determined to go that extra mile in making it work for a fashion that it was not intended for? If so, by all means, but know that it will require a lot of time, a lot of patience, a lot of effort. If you have some sewing skills in your arsenal, then you might want to utilize those for some minor alterations. But if not, you'll have to think very carefully about how you layer things, what you layer it with, and stuff like this. And as someone who enjoys both Lolita and retro fashions, I'd also urge you to simply consider getting into retro fashions. If you found a dress from a rockabilly vintage reproduction kind of brand that you love that much, why don't you wear it and appreciate it for what it is? And on that note, thank you so much for sticking through this more rambly than I would have wanted, but hopefully still coherent video. If you have enjoyed it, then make sure to give it a thumbs up, comment on it, and subscribe to the channel, as well as click the bell button next to it. Whilst I'm not necessarily planning on delving more into the topic of Lolita versus rockabilly, if that is something that you're interested in, by all means let me know. Otherwise, I have other videos planned on top of my usual one a month, which tends to be the Around Your Wardrobe in 30 Coordinates challenge ones. I do have other things either already filmed and waiting to be edited, or planned and waiting to be filmed. So hopefully I'll be able to keep up doing more than just one a month. But because even though I don't know that, make sure to click the bell button so that when I do upload something, you're notified of it. If you'd like to support me in creating more content, then I encourage you to either buy me a cup of coffee or join my Patreon. Links to both are in the description box below. And as always, I encourage all of you to check out my blog, which is Cupcakes and Unicorns, where you'll find more Lolita content. Thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye!